Last session, we learned from Professor Andrew Blakers about renewable energy generation. We learned that renewable energy is abundant in many parts of the world, especially in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. Today's session, we are gonna hear from Professor Polberg on one of the policies, how to realize the great potential of renewable energy in Southeast Asia. And Professor Berg will give us a fundamental understanding about carbon pricing, which is an increasingly interesting topic. Professor Polberg is the head of economics department here at the ANU, and he's done extensively research on carbon pricing as well as other policies for renewable energy in Asia Pacific and the world in general. So that's a great opportunity for us to learn from Professor Berg. Can I remind everyone to mute your microphone, please? Thank you very much. And please check whether your microphone is muted or not. Thank you. So no further ado, I would like to invite Professor Polberg for the session, and we also have facilitation from Mr. Tarek from MPAS in the Q&A questions. So over to you, Professor Polberg.
All right. Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for the introduction, Tung, and a big welcome to everyone to the session. It's really great to see you all. And looking through the list of participants, I actually know a few of you already from previous study and other encounters as well. So it's great to see all of you on the call. And I really hope the program has been going well for you as well. I'm an economist, and what we're going to do in this session is look at one of the most important potential economic reforms in any country. Climate change is one of the biggest challenges of our time. And really, we cannot leave it just to the engineers and others to fix it. We need to be bringing in economic tools as part of the battle. Carbon pricing is the #1 economic tool that we have. There are various policies we can go for, but carbon pricing is very popular among economists and has also been very effective whenever it has been used. I know this is a very hot topic these days. Indonesia is preparing to introduce a carbon tax in April 2022, that's next month. In Vietnam, there is consideration of carbon pricing, and more broadly, carbon pricing is spreading. So in this session today, what we're going to do is we'll talk about carbon pricing, the motivations for it, and the different models for carbon pricing as well. There'll be lots of breaks for questions and answers along the way. So make sure to raise your hands at those times or put your question into the chat as well. We face a big challenge. Countries in the Asia Pacific in particular are growing very quickly. Their energy use needs are growing very quickly as well. In some countries, electricity demand has been traditionally growing 6% per annum, 7%, 8%. It's very quick. If energy use keeps increasing, and if that energy use is fossil fuel intensive, well, we have a challenge, we have a problem. Emissions will keep increasing. They will exacerbate pollution problems locally and also globally, and leading to global climate change. The Asia Pacific region is the most important region. Already, the region is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases by a long way. If we look to the future, the region this century will be growing very quickly. And if that energy use growth is fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, well, we have a challenge. The world will be on track for more than 2 degrees of global warming. We have a big challenge. As you saw in the previous session, renewables are very attractive at the moment. However, we must also admit that fossil fuels still provide most of our energy needs. How can we hurry up in this move away from fossil fuels and towards clean options? What is a good policy solution? But first of all, the motivations. A big motivation for carbon pricing is to reduce local pollution. I wonder how pollution is in your city or your country these days. I know that in cities including Jakarta and Hanoi, there has been a lot of lots of problems with air pollution, outdoor air pollution, and in general, it has been getting worse. This is not just some small issue that environmentalists should care about. It actually affects everyone living in those cities in terms of health and other implications. There are some interesting estimates of the effect of outdoor particulates, PM 2.5 pollution. In some cities such as Jakarta, and this is a picture from Hanoi, some cities, the World Health Organization air pollution guidelines are often exceeded. Pollution is too high. There are some calculations about what that does to life expectancy for the average person in each country. The numbers are quite staggering. For example, for Vietnam, the estimate is that life expectancy is reduced by about 1.6 years due to outdoor particulate air pollution. That's a lot of lifetime, actually, 1.6 years. In Indonesia, it's even higher, 2.5 years. In Indonesia's case in particular, it's not only due to energy use, it's also due to deforestation, burning forests and burning peatland. But the problem is definitely there, and energy use and industry is a main contributor to this challenge. So a very key reason for emissions pricing is to try to steer away towards a cleaner future and away from a very emissions intensive future that leads to local costs. Notice that these local costs we can see in the picture, by and large, that's due to domestic emissions rather than emissions overseas. Motivation number 2 is that the world as a whole, the globe, is facing a huge challenge to be reducing anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions so as to slow down and eventually halt climate change. Simplifying as much as possible and slightly oversimplifying the science a little bit, basically we need to reduce emissions all the way down to zero, net zero, to stop temperature increases to any particular level. If we keep emitting in net terms, the temperature will just keep rising, and we have a long future in front of us. We could be heading beyond 2 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, 5 degrees, 6 degrees. If we keep emitting, we just keep going up. We have a big challenge to stop climate change, and in short, what is needed is for each country and the world as a whole to be moving towards not emitting in net terms. I just want to explain what net zero means. It doesn't mean not emitting at all. So there might still be some emissions from human activities. However, those emissions are offset by capturing emissions from the atmosphere, for example, by planting trees or direct capture using a machine and storing the emissions under the ground safely. To stop climate change, we have had a lot of efforts to reduce emissions. We have the Paris Agreement that all relevant countries are signed up to. So we have a lot of international efforts to do this, but we really need to be bringing the policy side more into play. And carbon pricing is a very useful way to do this. Countries in the region have ambitious emissions reduction targets. For example, in recent years, some very important countries in the Asia Pacific have announced net zero targets. The biggest and most important of these on the list, China here, net zero by 2060. That requires a fundamental change to China's economy. India, net zero by 2070. That's a huge commitment. Indonesia, net zero by 2060 has been announced as a government goal. Vietnam, net zero by 2050. Excellent. Good to see this type of ambition. And Australia also is not on this list, but Australia also has announced net zero by 2050. Japan, net zero by 2050. South Korea, net zero by 2050. The Philippines also does have emissions reduction targets. So the Philippines has a 75% emissions reduction commitment relative to business as usual by 2030. And that's actually a conditional target, conditional on international support. And yet to announce a formal net zero target. Key point here is countries in the region have emissions reduction commitments and goals. So these are domestic goals. The question then is how to achieve them, how to reach and head towards a net zero emissions economy. It's much easier to say than to do, and we really need to be using policy instruments to be steering us towards net zero. Policy options to reduce emissions. There are lots of different policies. In this session, we're going to be focusing on carbon pricing, which is one of the most powerful policies available. Near the end of the session, we'll also have a chance to talk about some other types of approaches that can be complements and that also can be substitutes as well. If carbon pricing is impossible, well, there are other tools in the kit. There are other policies that can be adopted. Even with a carbon price, there can be still a good case to be doing other things. For example, public grants and investment to encourage research and development in clean energy and in energy efficiency. Carbon pricing will be our focus. We're going to be looking at that. And there are two key ways of carbon pricing. The simplest is called carbon tax, emissions tax. There's also another approach called an emissions trading scheme. And there are various types of emissions trading scheme. Just briefly, some of these other policies, renewable portfolio standard. That's a requirement that the government sets that the electricity system must reach a certain quantity of renewables in the system, typically in terms of electricity generated from renewables over a year. Australia has one of these, a renewable portfolio standard, which helped us to move to 20% renewables in our electricity system by 2020. And we achieved that, and the key mechanism by which we did that was this one, a renewable portfolio standard. Reverse auctions, just briefly, a reverse auction is when the government or the electricity utility says, we would like to contract some clean electricity supply. We're going to have an auction, and the projects that can promise to supply at the lowest price will win, and we'll sign them up to some contracts. So a reverse auction is a bidding system to seek out the lowest suppliers of clean electricity. Public grants and investments, well, this is for things like research and development and adoption as well of clean technology. Feed-in tariffs have been quite common and popular, for example, in Indonesia and the Philippines and also Vietnam. A feed-in tariff is a guaranteed price for electricity output from renewables. And a feed-in tariff might be available, for example, for the next 10 years. If you sign your project up now, over the next 10 years, you can feed in your electricity to the grid at an agreed price. Vietnam has recently used this approach for solar and for wind as well. But for example, for solar, Vietnam has said, if you have a solar project, you can feed your solar into the grid at this set price. And if the price is high enough, it can be very attractive to the market. Another approach to reduce emissions is regulations. For example, a country could regulate coal-fired power stations and say they must achieve a certain emissions efficiency if they want to feed into the grid. There are many other policies, and please, I wonder if you can think about some other ideas for reducing emissions in terms of policies. Another important one, especially in Indonesia, is this one: removal of fossil fuel subsidies. In some countries, including Indonesia, some fossil fuels have been available at a cheap price, and that has encouraged a lot of use of the fossil fuels and emissions from that. Over the years, Indonesia has had quite a bit of success at removing and reducing these fossil fuel subsidies, but still some way to go. Facilitating phase out of fossil fuels, for example, planning what to do with the coal mining areas, what to do with the coal mining communities and workers as we move away from coal. Government plans in countries such as Germany have been an important part of the process. The final one here is called renewable energy zone planning. This idea is, okay, so in our country, there are some areas that are very good for renewables. So let's plan to build the grid to those areas. Let's plan to harness those areas and really develop them to enjoy the wind and solar resources in those locations. Currently in Australia, we're pursuing this approach, building transmission lines to where the renewables are strongest. If you have some other ideas, please feel free to put them in the chat or to save them up for later. We're going to come back to alternative policies later. Our focus in this session is carbon price. So carbon price is a very key approach that has been used by countries in Europe, that's been used by Singapore and other countries as well to really try to drive down those carbon emissions. One of the beauties of a carbon price is it focuses on the problem. The problem is the carbon emissions. To directly seek to drive them down and have an incentive to do that, a good way to go about it is to put a price on those emissions. If there's a price, the economy naturally will seek to reduce emissions to avoid paying that price. We're going to cover some introductory concepts and then we'll go to a question and answer break. So some key concepts. When economists think about this issue of emissions, the way economists think about it is as follows. Pollution is an example of a negative externality. What is an externality? An externality is when the decisions of one firm or one person or one agency have an impact on another, but in an unintended way, and this occurs outside of a market. So there's no handshake agreement. It's something that happens externally from the main activities of that firm. An example, I've got a picture of a trumpet here. An example is, a simple example, if you have a neighbor and they play the trumpet. If they're playing the trumpet at 5 a.m. in the morning and you can hear it, well, that's an example of a negative externality to you. It's disrupting you, disturbing your sleep. It's probably not the goal of your neighbor to be doing that. They want to practice the trumpet, but they're causing this negative externality to you. And if they're not thinking about those costs they impose on you, well, they might keep playing the trumpet. Emissions and pollution are a very similar thing to this example. As a result of externalities, market-based economies might not do so well. If in our production activities, a lot of the costs are not borne internally, but are socialized or shared onto others, well, when I make my production decisions, I might not care about those costs so much. If I'm emitting, those costs are shared with everybody. For me to reduce my emitting, I have to incur some cost. So because the externalities are shared with everybody, well, a market-based economy might not actually work so well in helping to achieve good outcomes. We might well end up with a situation of too many negative externalities, too much pollution. Economists, if they visit a big city, such as Beijing or Delhi or Jakarta, and they see a pollution problem like this, economists would not typically think, this is good. This is the economy working well. It's not good. The pollution is not a good thing, and it's a negative byproduct of the economic activity and economic decisions being made there. Pollution is a classic example of a negative externality. The coal-fired power station is polluting, not with the goal of hurting people and reducing their life expectancy. They're polluting because they're trying to make a profit from producing the coal-fired power. They're trying to do their job of producing electricity, and the emissions are a byproduct. Pollution is a very classic example of a negative externality. Firms and people release pollution without considering the effects on others, without properly taking that cost on board and incorporating it into their profit analysis. The market finds it difficult to solve this problem. The very key reason for this is market economies work very well for some things. For example, if I'm hungry, I can go and buy some bread. Bread is a private good, and it's very physically easy to trade in. You can make some bread, you can physically hand it to me, I can physically give some money back. Humans have traded bread for thousands of years. Pollution is very different because it's into the global commons, into the atmosphere. It's very difficult for us to directly transact in pollution or pollution reduction, unless the government establishes a market in pollution permits, which is called an emissions trading scheme. Without the government stepping in, the market finds it very difficult to solve pollution problems. And throughout economic history, we have seen these problems time and time again. In London, during the Industrial Revolution, the place was very polluted. In Beijing, the city was very polluted, and so on. The good thing about renewables is that it gives us a chance to develop with less pollution. But we need policies to be helping us to do that. The key reason why the private sector finds it quite difficult to solve this problem is that private firms don't know how to make money from doing this. So if a private firm takes some actions to reduce pollution, what is the business model? How can they make a profit from this? The market finds it very difficult to deliver a profit to that firm for that action. Can you see it's very different to selling bread? If you sell bread, you can get some revenue and hopefully make a profit. If you sell emissions reductions, how do you make some money? So we have what economists call a situation of market failure. Private markets do very poorly in terms of self-correcting this problem. And it's very traditional and orthodox to argue that there's a very important role for government. And that's a key reason why we have ministries of environment and so on. So we have an underlying problem here. Private markets are very good at doing some things, but just look at the sky in some cities. They're not doing some things very well, and a key problem that we have is the problem of pollution. Tarek, I just want to pause here, just in case there are any questions. Happy to take any.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So we've got a couple of ways you can ask questions. You would have seen a note in the chat there. If you've got a question you'd like to ask directly, please raise your hand and I'll look for your hand token and invite you to ask. And also, if you don't want to physically ask the question yourself, write it into the chat and I can also ask the question. So we have Cristianto from Philippines who's got his hand raised. Let me pass to you, Cristianto.
Sorry, I'm from Indonesia.
Oh, sorry, Cristianto, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor Brooke. It's quite interesting introduction from you about the situation here in Indonesia. And I cannot agree more about that because, yeah, that's what happens in Indonesia, right? But there's one intriguing statement saying that Indonesia right now are currently trying to reduce the subsidy for the fossil fuels, right? But then for us, Indonesia, that is quite sensitive policy because it's affect the welfare of every citizenship in Indonesia. For example, low price fuel were used for not only by the industry but also for, I don't know, like small income household. And then to reduce such fossil-based fuel may affect the poverty rate in Indonesia. So that's a quite tricky policy for us government to implement with. But we're not quite there yet, but we are like gradually implementing it. But then what I want to address is when we try to subsidize the implementations of renewable energy in Indonesia, we have experience from my perspective. I'm from the Ministry of Trade. From my perspective, we have challenges not only from the domestic stakeholders, but also from our trading partners. So as we all know that Indonesia are part of WTO. So when we implement something that will be viewed as subsidies for renewable energy and something like that. For example, some of our palm oil factories are using their own methane gas to produce their own energy, and then they can sell such electricity to our national energy company. But such scheme can be viewed as subsidies that can be challenged by our trading partners, and then it makes us have more difficulties to export our, I don't know, products that enjoy such subsidy scheme. So I don't know it is proper questions to ask right now in these sessions, but I think we have to, I don't know, we have to have a general agreement on which guideline or which silver lining that we have to agree for us countries to subsidize our renewable energy scheme. Thank you.
Thank you, Cristiano. Firstly, on the fossil fuel subsidies, once you have them, they can be challenging to remove. But remember, Indonesia, especially under President Jokowi, has shown that removing fuel subsidies is possible. You have to pick the right moment and do it in the right way. Indonesia has done it very well because Indonesia has coupled it with cash-based transfers to low-income households via the card system that you have. On your point about WTO compatibility of renewable subsidies, Europe and other countries they've been using renewable subsidies for many years, and these have never been challenged in the WTO. So there's no precedent so far for standard types of environmental payments or renewable subsidies to be challenged so far. So in general, I would say don't worry about that unless there's a very specific precedent that you're worried about, and happy to chat more specifically later on. Yeah, back to you, Tarek.
Thanks, Paul. So we had one question from Lilybeth Morales in Philippines, which is about elaborating more. I think let's, Lilybeth, we'll come back to your question towards the end of the presentation, because Professor Paul does have more slides. So he may in his elaboration cover what you're looking for. If not, we'll come back to you. One question from colleagues in Vietnam, Ms. Nhan Tran, has asked about how do we decide the price for carbon and how do we monitor the carbon trading? So I'm not sure, Paul, if you will cover that later on, but do you want to just say a couple of thoughts about that one?
Yeah, good question. We will be touching on this. The key thing with determining the price, well, we could follow the recommendations of, for example, World Bank. They suggest go for quite a high price. Or we could go for a more politically practical approach, start with a low price and increase it. In general, I would recommend that. Start with a low price and then increase it over time. Singapore is a very good example. They started with a carbon tax at a low price, 5 Singaporean dollars. It's just about $3 US per ton CO2. Start low and increase later is a very smart approach, but I'll come back to it later on.
Okay, and maybe Paul, if we've got time for we've got Ahmed Murdani from Indonesia has got his hand raised. So Ahmed, if you've got a quick question for Paul before we continue. You're on mute, I think, Ahmed.
Okay, I was muted by the admin, I think. Okay, thank you very much, Tarek and Paul. So really interesting topic about the carbon pricing, as it is also cannot be separated with the policy and politics also. Like what I'm reading about the carbon pricing and tax in Australia, that in the early beginning of the implementation and carbon tax in Australia, and also its impact to when the government change, when the what we call someone that after that it changed, it's also changed policy, and it becomes also uncertainty in the future. So sometimes the private firms and also developer, as well as the IPPs of renewable energy, as well as industry, also facing like uncertainties in renewable energy and also carbon pricing policies in the future, as it also follows the policy itself and the politics, I mean. So what do you think about this, Paul? Thanks.
Well, I agree. And in Australia, we had a carbon price that was working quite well. And then we did have a change of government, and the change of government, the new one, decided to remove it. So key thing for us is to start off by looking what is the first best policy. And let's just bring it back to that. Let's just start with looking at the first best policy. Notice also that many countries that have adopted carbon pricing, they still have it. It's been successful. So this instrument can be very successful and sustainable as well. Countries like Japan, countries in Europe, they have kept carbon pricing in place. So we'll come back to a few other examples as we go. I want to start with keeping going with the motivation for carbon pricing and the broad way that it works. I want to start with a very simple question to make sure that we're all thinking as economists. Let's just imagine maybe a silly question. What would happen if the government were to introduce a tax on windows? It seems silly, but the government of England actually did introduce this tax hundreds of years ago. What would happen if the government put a tax on windows? The answer is, and we can see it here in this picture, we can substitute away from windows. We can brick them up like this example right here. Once we brick up a window, it's no longer a window and becomes a wall. When we build a new house, we can build them with not many windows, right? So a tax on windows would introduce and lead to substitution away from having big windows. Why did England do this hundreds of years ago? Well, they could measure the windows from outside. So it's easier to measure than wealth in those old days. And also, richer people have larger windows at their houses, so it could be progressive. That's why they did it. I do not recommend a tax on windows, but the point here is, look at the substitution that happens when taxes are introduced. We could show many, many different examples. Humans love changing our affairs to reduce our tax bill. We love changing our decisions in response to taxes, and we do it all the time. Prices are very powerful things. And what we really want to be doing is harnessing the power of prices and that human response, as seen in this picture with the window tax and the response away from windows. We want to do that with emissions tax, and move away from emissions. A very similar example is in the Netherlands. In the old days, they had a tax on the width of houses. Well, at least the width of houses is easy to measure, right? What happens if you have such a tax? You might still have big houses, but they are likely to be skinny, like in this example here. They could be deep and tall, but probably going to be skinny, right? Because the tax is on the width of the house. People substitute away from what is being taxed. The goal of this session is not to recommend window tax or house width tax, but to use the lesson from these examples. Can we come up with a similar approach to help to reduce emissions? Can we bring the power of taxation, the power of the tax office into play in helping us to provide the incentive to move away from emissions? Can everyone see the point here? Let's use these examples and let's bring it back to the environment. Can we use a tax to help improve the environment? I want to start off with another example to really get you thinking. Imagine that you are the board of a company. It's a very big board, more than 100 members. I am a technology inventor. I have a new technology that can help to reduce your emissions from your company. I invented it, my new technology. To buy my technology, it will cost your company. You have to pay me. It will cost about $10 million. I come to your board meeting and I do the presentation. I put on my suit jacket and I do my presentation. Currently, your company can emit carbon dioxide into the air with no hindrance, no tax, no regulation stopping you. You can just emit your emissions whenever you want. My question is, would you be interested in my technology? It will cost your company $10 million and that's it. It will help you to reduce your emissions. I wonder if anyone would like to click raise hand and just mention, would you be interested in my technology or not? Or add it to the chat. Just a yes or a no in the chat would be useful. No, I see some no's in the chat. The key reason for saying no, quite a few no's going into the chat, some yeses though, but quite a few no's. Key reason for saying no here is that it does not help your company to boost its profit, right? The goal of the board, your duty, is to boost the profit of the firm, maintain and boost the profit. So in general, you will not be interested in my technology, and you might quickly show me the door when I mentioned that it will cost you $10 million. Do you agree? The point is, green entrepreneurs do not have many opportunities. if there is no carbon price or emission regulation, because firms can continue to emit any day of the week with no implication. I want to change this question just slightly. Every year, your company is paying $20 million per annum in carbon tax to the Ministry of Finance. $20 million per annum. My technology, I present to you, it can help you to substantially reduce your annual emissions and therefore substantially reduce your carbon tax payments to the government. My question is, would you now be more interested in my presentation and my technology? Please put yes or no. I can see lots of yeses coming into the chat. I love Zoom chat. It's very interesting. I see lots of yeses. Suddenly, you're interested in me. You're not showing me the door anymore. You're wanting to hear more about my technology. Can you see the power of a carbon tax? Suddenly, there is a market for my product. I'm a green entrepreneur. Suddenly, people are interested in hearing my information about my product. A carbon tax, the key goal is to create innovation, improvements, emissions reductions, help the economy move to a green direction. That is the goal of it, to create an incentive to adopt clean techniques, to adopt energy efficiency improvements, to adopt solar and wind, to adopt geothermal, and so on. It opens up opportunities in clean technology, and that is the key goal. Thank you for all your chat responses. Tarek, I just want to pause and maybe there's a question, there's a good one or two.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. It's I'm very interested in your technology, and I agree with one of the comments in there that economists are interesting. So this is a very interesting presentation. Anybody want to raise their hand to ask the question directly? Okay, we have Mr. Phuc from Vietnam. Please ask your question. If we could unmute Mr. Phuc and let him ask his question.
Yeah, I have just about the application of the carbon tax, because developing countries attract more investment from FDIs because of their low cost, labor low and environment costs. If developing countries like Vietnam, Indonesia impose the carbon tax, I think the cost for production will increase. So many FDI will leave those countries, and if the markets like in Europe, US, they don't impose a regulation about the products due to the carbon certificate, something like this, I think it will fail to encourage government to impose a carbon tax in developing countries. So do you have any idea about this issue?
Good question. First of all, Europe is wanting to move towards what is called Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM. And this would put a penalty on, let me just put that in the chat, CBAM. This would put a penalty on products produced in countries like Vietnam that have not had proper carbon pricing applied to them. Also, a well-designed carbon price reform can make it more attractive for FDI. For example, you could cut labor tax, you could cut corporate income tax and introduce carbon tax. Total tax bill might reduce for companies, but it's a tax shift towards carbon tax. Just one more point before I hand back. Foreign investors are not so keen on having very polluted cities either. It makes markets less attractive for them. If the country has a very green reputation, that's attractive for foreign investors and actually could lead to more. So really it's about how it's done. It's possible to design it in a way that would boost FDI. Thank you.
Yeah, a good point, Paul. And we've certainly seen in the rooftop solar sector in Vietnam a strong interest from companies to wanting to have a green rooftop in their businesses. There's another question from Pat Cristianto. Would you please ask your question?
Okay, thank you. Professor Brook, now that you mentioned CBAM, that's getting more interesting for me because this is like a contentious issue for us, Indonesia, in the framework of international trade. So, while you're mentioning about carbon tax and carbon pricing, is there any international standard that we can refer to when we try to apply carbon tax and pricing? For example, the EU has their own carbon tax scheme and pricing. Well, that's why in the first stage of CBAM, there are only 4 scope of industries that they were implementing on, such as I don't know, aluminum and steel and so on. But then other countries has also have their own carbon tax and pricing. While here in Indonesia, we are currently trying to develop our own carbon tax and pricing, which is probably will not be the same with the EU or with any other developed countries standards. So how can we try to synchronize all these different standards about carbon tax and pricing? And then which type of industries that we should implement the carbon tax first? For example, in Indonesia, a lot of our exports are heavily focused from, I don't know, for example, steel industry are heavily focused now using furnace from gas and coal. So if we try to implement that it will hinder our export then. So is there any
good question, Pak? Paul, do you want to answer that one about the implications for exports?
We will be coming back to this a little bit more, but I mean, firstly, on the international standardization, there's no one model that every country uses, and exactly as summarized, different countries have developed different approaches. China, emissions trading scheme. European Union, emissions trading scheme. Singapore, carbon tax. The key thing, though, is to try to follow best principles, cover as many emissions as possible, set the price so that it will be comparable to other countries. Those are the key principles. In terms of exports, well, remember, carbon tax will be generating revenue that could help you to reduce other taxes. You can actually boost the size of the economy and boost exports via a tax reform, of which carbon tax is actually one part. Also, if you're wanting to export clean products, well, if you have a green reputation, foreign investors will be much more interested in investing in the country.
Paul, we've got one more hand raised. I know we appreciate we have to move, get to the end of the presentation, but if we can just ask Miss Chile from Vietnam to ask her question, quick one.
Yeah. Thank you for the informative session today. And I have one question. In case carbon tax is implied, how should there be any regulation about the using that tax? For example, government will get money from carbon tax, but if government use that tax to invest or to do some activities that lead to carbon emission increase, so I think that tax is not really meaningless. It's kind of meaningless. So I wonder, should there be any regulation about the using tax? That's my question.
About using the tax revenue,
Yes.
The key thing is that once a carbon tax is in place, there'll be a strong incentive to reduce emissions. The revenue from the carbon tax could be used for many different things. There's no need to exactly set a rule or regulation for it. It could be used for education or for health and these things, and they do not lead to many emissions. Yeah. So no need for a specific regulation.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks,
I understand. Yes.
Okay, so let's keep moving. The idea really is to bring the tax collector into play and get the tax system helping. We should not leave the environmental effort just to the Ministry of Environment. We need to be bringing in the tax collector to help. Smart taxes can be used to help the environment, not just reducing carbon emissions, but improving other environmental situations as well. Economics is pretty clear on this and suggests very strongly that ideally taxes would be charged on activities that cause negative externalities, and taxes would be charged relative to the size of the negative externality. If it's a bigger negative externality, the tax rate should be higher. Many economists support the use of a carbon price. In fact, almost all economists do, many. Did you know that carbon pricing has been used for more than 30 years now? The first country to introduce a carbon price was Finland in 1990 when it introduced a carbon tax that is still in place today. Other countries such as the Netherlands and Sweden introduced carbon prices shortly after. What are some benefits of a carbon price? Specifically a carbon tax, because it's the easiest and simplest. An emissions trading scheme is similar too. Reduce emissions and in a low cost way. This is a very important point, and one reason why economists are very in love with carbon pricing. They can help to incentivize the lowest cost emissions reductions. Encourage the adoption of clean energy, such as solar and wind. Encourage research and development in clean energy. Open up whole new careers and markets for things such as energy efficiency and zero emission techniques. Raise revenue for the government. In some countries such as Indonesia, one of the goals is to boost government revenue divided by GDP. Well, one way to do that is via use of a carbon tax. It helps to achieve that goal. And what could revenue be used for? It should be used for the best available thing. It might be education, it might be improving the environment, it might be health. A carbon tax also has the benefit of reducing the need to do other things. If you have a good carbon tax in place, well, there's less need to have a subsidy scheme for clean energy. There's less need to have regulations on coal-fired power stations. There still might be a case for some other things, but in general, you don't have to worry so much. I summarize this with a very short saying, tax and relax. If you have a carbon tax in place, you don't have to do quite so many other things. The need to have a subsidy scheme is greatly reduced. For the government budget, this is very beneficial. I want to use this graph, this map here, this graph here, picture, to explain how an emissions tax works. For this, you need to be focused and to be thinking very abstractly. Let's imagine that each of these fruits, they're apples, but I will call them fruits. Each of these fruits is an emissions reduction project. This one here, this one here, this one here. Across the economy, there are many ways to reduce emissions. Energy efficiency improvements, switching fuel, solar panels, wind, geothermal, biofuels, so many, electric vehicles. We could keep listing. Each of these fruits is an emissions reduction potential. Key thing on this tree here is this. The lower ones are the cheaper ones on this picture. So this one here is a cheap one. This one here is quite cheap. This one here is pretty cheap. These ones here are expensive in terms of the cost per unit emissions reduction. Does it make sense? Cheap ones are at the bottom, expensive ones are at the top. The idea with a carbon price is like this, and I'm going to do some live editing. Let me actually bring it back. Let's imagine that we bring a carbon price in like this, tax. This is something like $10 per ton CO2. These emissions reduction projects below that line are emissions reduction projects for which the cost per ton CO2 reduction is below $10. So the tax is $10 per ton CO2. This one here is, for example, $2. This one here is $8. Imagine you're in the private sector. Would you rather reduce emissions for $2 per ton CO2 or pay the tax at $10 per ton CO2? That's my question to you. One option is reduce emissions, $2 per ton CO2, for example, by switching fuels. Another option is pay the carbon tax $10 per ton CO2. You're working for a private company. Which of those would you choose? Pay the tax or reduce your emissions? Could you please add it to the chat? Just, you can type reduce or pay tax. Look at these replies in the chat. Very good, I agree. You would reduce your emissions because it's much better just to pay $2 per ton to avoid the issue than to pay $10 tax bill on your emissions, right? That's it. You'd reduce those emissions. You'd actually implement all of these projects below the line that I have drawn. Do you agree? Because paying $8 per ton CO2 is better than paying $10 for tax. That's it. You have an incentive to go for, in English, we would say, pick the lowest hanging fruit. The carbon tax exactly gives you that incentive. Remember on the earlier slide, I said a carbon tax gives the incentive for low cost emissions reductions. We see that on this tree. If the carbon tax is $10 per ton CO2, and this project here, can you see this project? This one is $20 per ton CO2. Would you implement this project or would you just pay the carbon tax? The answer is, it's better to pay the carbon tax. Carbon tax was $10 per ton CO2. It's cheaper than this expensive project of $20. Does it make sense? The carbon tax does exactly what economists would want. It gives the incentive for the best emissions reduction steps to be taken, and for the expensive ones not to be taken. We want to do the cheap things first. Why do the expensive ones? We don't want to waste money. So a carbon tax is very amazing, actually, in that all the government does is set the tax price and administer the system. There is then an incentive across the economy to choose cheap projects to reduce emissions. You might think, well, we actually want to reduce more emissions than just these ones below the tax rate. If the government wants to reduce more emissions, the way to do that, increase the tax rate. If the tax rate is $15, then people will implement more projects. Does it make sense? Once it goes up from $10 to $15, suddenly these projects will be implemented by the private sector. I call this tree the emissions reduction tree or the abatement tree. The key thing is lower fruits are cheaper. A carbon tax gives the signal to the market. Please reduce your emissions and please choose the cheapest way to do that. And this text in the box here is saying exactly what I just said. An incentive is given to the private sector to choose the cheapest abatement options. One final point before we keep moving. The good thing about a carbon tax is all the government needs to do is set up the tax and implement it. Make sure companies are not cheating. If they're emitting, they must pay the carbon tax for each ton of CO2. A good feature of a carbon tax is the government does not need to make decisions of which emissions reduction projects are implemented or which abatement projects are implemented. Abatement means emissions reduction. For example, the government might not know which truly are the cheapest ways to reduce emissions. Who in the economy knows? The answer is the private sector knows best how they can do things in their own firm to reduce their emissions. A mining company knows best how it can reduce its emissions cheaply. It knows this much better than government officials sitting in Canberra, Manila, Jakarta, or Hanoi. Because the local firms, they have the information and the incentive to be identifying the best ways to reduce emissions. So a very good thing about a carbon tax is the government doesn't need to do so much. Just put the carbon tax in place. Make sure the system works without cheating. And then the private sector will go ahead and choose the lowest cost abatement options to be reducing emissions. The idea is something called green growth. This graph, don't worry about the units. It's just an example graph. On the x-axis is GDP, which is the size of the economy. On the y-axis is emissions. Your economy might be on a trajectory like this. The Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam basically have all been on trajectories that look like this, right? That was true for the US and China and other countries too. The goal with a carbon tax is to steer that down. The goal is not to end GDP growth. It's not the goal. The goal is to reduce emissions. We can go for something that is called green growth. So the emissions start to fall below the business as usual trajectory. Hopefully the emissions fall in absolute level as well, slowly towards zero. It's possible that if we do a good carbon tax reform, that the economy could even grow more than without it. Why do I say that? Well, some sectors prefer no pollution. For example, the tourism sector. Polluted cities are not attractive for tourists relative to a clean city. Also, a good carbon tax reform, we introduce the carbon tax. We reduce other distorting taxes. And that could, in net terms, help the economy to grow more quickly. Also, if we use the carbon tax revenue for things like education, well, that can be good for the economy as well, especially in the long run. All right, I just want to pause in case there's a question or two.
Great, thanks, Paul. I like your tax and relax slogan. It's a nice way to capture a lot of the points you're making. There was a couple of themes that are emerging in the question, so I've sort of looked to see how to group them together. And one is that when we look at, there's a couple of questions around a carbon tax and how it will affect everyone. Will it affect everyone equally? And will it, for example, burden poor people more than non-poor people, or will it burden the end consumer more? So could you talk about the sort of the equity of the distribution of benefits and costs from a carbon tax a little bit?
If it's designed poorly, well, it's true that it could have some effects on inequality and increasing poverty. But in general, if it's designed well, this could be a poverty reducing intervention. For example, if we put a carbon tax in place and we use some of the revenue to increase the cash transfers to low-income households and to cut income tax for low and middle income households? Well, we can have a reduction in poverty as a result of the overall reform. Please note that the largest emitters in countries including Indonesia, Vietnam, and Philippines tend to be higher income people. They drive large vehicles. They use more electricity. Carbon tax raises revenue, and that revenue can be used for very good things, including cash transfers. And Indonesia is a great place to do that because Indonesia has quite a well-developed cash transfer system. Thank you.
Okay, we have Ibu Alin from Indonesia who's got her hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Paul, for your great presentation. I would like to ask about the short-term shock of this carbon tax, because when, for example, one country impose a certain level of carbon tax, they should pay this tax in, for example, per year. But the problem is when they the decision to make this abatement activity is investment that is quite long term, so they have to, they have to make this investment decision that need maybe require financing at the beginning, and then how this company should make this decision, particularly when the technology is still expensive in one country, maybe compared to the average world or the first mover country, because of maybe some problem of technology transfer or adoption. So the problem with and then the second one, how should we set the carbon tax rate? Because I think we should make the rate in line with the emission reduction, and how the government should think about the potential. Oh, this rate will reduce this amount of emission, because from the three that you draw before, I think when we set a quite low carbon tax, it will the abatement activity will be low also. So,
Thanks.
yeah.
Thanks, Ibu Alin. So a couple of quick questions there for you, Paul.
Good questions. First of all, on the investment uncertainty. Well, investment uncertainty exists even without a carbon price, right? Whether you're interested in investing in coal or natural gas or other things. So this one small intervention of carbon tax doesn't solve uncertainty problems for decades to come, but it's one key step to make sure that decisions get pushed towards the green direction. The very key thing is, for a carbon price, I say start low because it can be easier to introduce politically, and is much less of a shock if it starts low, like in Singapore, and like Indonesia is planning to do as well. The key thing, though, is to have a very clear trajectory with the carbon tax so that it is known that it will be higher in the future. If investors know that in 10 years the carbon tax will be higher, 20 years as well, then they can build that into their investment decisions right now and switch towards solar instead of coal. That's really the way to do it. So start relatively low so the initial shock is not too big, but have quite an aggressive trajectory upwards. And that can quite smoothly transition the economy away from emitting.
One last question, Paul, and it's relating to one that sort of popped up in a few questions, but you mentioned that the good thing about the carbon tax is the government does not need to decide how to do the abatements, and that the private sector knows best. From an economic point of view, that is obviously the case, but what do we do with this problem of externalities? What happens if the approach to reducing carbon emissions results in other kinds of externalities that, say that a private sector chooses that one because it has a a good good from their economic point of view, but maybe it's not best from the commons point of view. What role does government play in terms of ensuring that the best carbon tax solution is also the best solution for other objectives of the country?
Interesting question. If it's possible that the substitution involves hurting the environment in some other ways, well, that's a separate environmental issue and it deserves a proper government intervention. Just as one example, if people are clearing pristine forest for solar panels, that's not what we want. There need to be deforestation regulations, and that's a separate intervention. So it's actually a very good question, and a carbon tax, it doesn't seek to solve every problem in society. If there are other things going on, for example, deforestation or some waste problem or something like that from solar panels, well, we need some other interventions, require recycling of the panels, prevent deforestation directly, and so on.
Okay, thanks a lot, Paul. Very, very good answer.
I want to move on to a very key point. I've been talking about carbon tax so far. Carbon tax is the simplest one. It just simply involves putting a tax on fossil fuel use, and the tax rate is higher if there are many emissions from it. That's how the tax actually gets imposed. It's a tax on fossil fuels, and the exact tax rate is higher for coal than for natural gas, for example. It's higher when you have a higher emissions intensity. So a carbon tax, countries have been using taxes for a long time. Ministry of Finance is normally familiar with how to design a tax. I want to introduce another approach, which is like the close cousin of carbon tax. It's called Emissions Trading Scheme, ETS. It works like this. A limit is set on the total quantity of emissions allowed in an economy or in a sector. This is called the cap. The ETS that I am explaining is called cap and trade. The cap is divided into permits. And please have a look at my video. See some permits. The government creates these permits. Can you see them? This is just like a permit for land or something like that, but this is a permit to pollute. The total number of permits equals the cap. These permits are then either allocated to the economy or auctioned. The best approach is to auction them because that raises revenue for the government. That revenue can be used for good things like building schools or cutting other taxes or whatever the country's priority is. These permits can then be traded around. So if I have a permit that I do not need, I can sell it on the market. If you need more permits, you can buy them. We trade them around. If we emit, we must acquit a permit. That means we must hand back the permit to the government. We must. If there's cheating, the scheme does not work. If we emit, we must use up a permit to cover our emissions. With an ETS, a market emerges for pollution. If you want to pollute, you can actually, but you must have a permit. The permit is scarce. The number of permits is scarce. Look, there's only this many. Because it's a scarce and valuable commodity, it will have a price. The price is determined by supply and demand. Supply is the number of permits released by the government. Demand is the demand of coal power stations, cement producers, and others for emitting. These two things, supply and demand, interact in the market and determine the price. Because these are valuable and have a price, it means that emissions are expensive, and it gives us an incentive to reduce our emissions. If we reduce our emissions, we do not need to buy as many permits. Can you see it? quite similar to a carbon tax. Can everyone see it? Under both approaches, there's a price to emit. And actually, that's it. There's therefore an incentive to reduce your emissions. Differences between a carbon tax and an ETS. In the chat, please add any big difference if you would like, if you can think of any. A very key difference, I want to add these in live time, so please also feel free to take some notes of it. I just want to add some very simple differences here. A carbon tax sets the price of emissions. That's it. The government makes a decision. Oops. The government makes a decision. ETS sets the total quantity. That's actually the key difference between these two mechanisms. That's it. That's the key difference. If we look in more detail, there are some other differences between these approaches. Under a carbon tax, the price remains constant unless the government changes it. For example, each year the government could increase the carbon tax rate. But if it doesn't do that, the carbon tax remains constant. And that's true even if there's a negative shock to the economy or anything like that. The carbon tax would just stay the same, the rate. For example, $5 per ton CO2 equivalent, for example. In the ETS, the price varies. If the country has a recession, well, the demand to emit would fall and the price would tend to fall. So that's one of the key differences here. Under an ETS, one difference is, and thank you very much, I see in the chat some good comments coming in. One of the differences, the ETS does involve trading, whereas a simple carbon tax is easier. It just involves paying the tax to the government. This actually is an advantage for a carbon tax. It doesn't involve this trading activity. It's simpler. We don't have to learn as much about how this market operates. It's simply just paying the tax to the government. And private sector firms are very familiar with doing that already. Both of these instruments can raise revenue, so that's not a difference between them. There are some other differences. So ETS might be easier to link to other systems overseas, but that's not necessarily an advantage, actually. I'll put that one there too. In the chat, please do add any other differences that you do notice. We'll have more question time coming up too. There are also options that are in between. So it's possible to go for a hybrid scheme. Hybrid. What is a hybrid? A hybrid scheme is in between carbon tax and emissions trading scheme, cap and trade. In a hybrid scheme, it's a bit different. A carbon tax focuses on the price. The price is just the tax rate. A cap and trade ETS focuses on the overall quantity, not the quantity of any individual firm, but the overall quantity as set by the cap. A hybrid scheme focuses a bit on both. So we could focus on the price, but increase the price if our emissions are too high. And there are lots of different hybrid schemes that we could think about going for. Examples. We could have a carbon tax, but we adjust it. We increase it or reduce it over time as we try to steer towards our quantity target. In that example, we care about the price and the quantity. So it's a hybrid. We're caring about both of those dimensions. We could also have an emissions trading scheme, but we have some constraints on the price. We don't want the price to get too high or too low. So we allow it to vary in what is called a price collar. So at the top, there's a price ceiling. At the bottom, there's a price floor. And the ETS price must stay within the collar. How does the government or the regulator achieve this? Well, for example, if the price is getting very high, the government could release more permits onto the market if they have an emissions trading scheme. If the price is getting too low, the government could buy some permits to increase the demand in the market and therefore increase that price to keep it within the collar. One interesting thing, these are designer markets. It's possible to do many different designs. It's possible to have a tax and an ETS at the same time. The tax is there, it could be a bit small, but at least that will make sure that the price never falls too low. If the tax is just $5 per tonne CO2, for example, well, the price will never fall below $5 per tonne. And then you could have an ETS as well, where the price is moving. It sounds like there are many options, and there are. Designing carbon pricing, there are many decision variables, many options. It's possible to have a carbon tax and an ETS at the same time. What is an example? Finland has a carbon tax and is a member of the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme. Previously, the United Kingdom had a carbon tax and was also a member of the EU ETS. After Brexit, they have left EU ETS though. Which countries price carbon? Currently, 45 countries have a national or subnational carbon price scheme. This actually includes international European ETS as well. Most European countries have a carbon price. Almost all European countries have a carbon price. All EU countries, plus others, including Switzerland, United Kingdom, Norway, and so on. Other countries in Europe, for example, Ukraine, have a carbon price. Japan has a small carbon tax, plus also has 2 emissions trading schemes for individual cities. South Korea, national emissions trading scheme. China, national emissions trading scheme. Singapore, carbon tax. Kazakhstan, emissions trading scheme, and so on. New Zealand, emissions trading scheme. South Africa, carbon tax, and so on. United States, only some states, for example, California, have a carbon price, and they are all emissions trading schemes. On a map, which countries have carbon prices? And this map is as of 2021. We can't see Singapore on this map. It seems too small to see it on the map, but Singapore should be colored. We can see that it's still not everywhere. In Africa, only 1 country so far, but in general, it has been spreading. And next month, we can add Indonesia to the club. One day, we'll be able to add other countries too. Notice that some other countries have related mechanisms. For example, India and the Philippines have levies on coal or coal tax. It's actually similar to a carbon tax, but it's actually not a carbon tax because it's not imposed based on the carbon emissions. It's just a commodity levy on coal. Over time, carbon pricing adoption has been increasing. We had the first scheme in 1990. We can see the big increases recently, and the key steps were EU ETS and China ETS. They're the very key steps up. But there are other steps along the way as well, including expansion of the EU ETS to other countries and other sectors too. I want to pause, Tarek, in case there's a couple of questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Paul. I think there has been a lot of questions being asked. One quick one to clarify was, you mentioned that Australia had a carbon pricing scheme, but it wasn't shown on the map. Is that because of the nature of what we've got in Australia, or just...
Australia had a good carbon pricing scheme before, but it was removed by the government. And the World Bank has dropped Australia from the map. Currently, Australia has a smaller offsetting scheme where there is some trading in permits, but the World Bank decided that it was not good enough to be shown on the map. Thanks, Tarek.
There was also a question about cap itself? Like it's not, can the cap be set not based on the quantity, an absolute cap, but on, let's say, the carbon intensity? Like, could you put a cap on like carbon intensity, and would that be effective?
You could. Problem is that emissions might still increase a lot if the economy is growing quickly and if your cap is based on intensity.
Mhm.
But the shorter answer is this is a designer market situation, and you could. It's very possible to do that.
Mhm.
The question also, what should you consider in determining the cap? Key thing is the emissions reduction goals of the country. If your country has a net zero goal and your cap is not consistent with working towards it, well, you might need to tighten that cap.
And we've got a hand raised from Aulia Pratama from Indonesia. Miss Aulia, you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Tarek and Paul. I have a question about, I have ever heard about the fraud or scam in carbon trading emission scheme. So my question is how to avoid any fraud or scheme or scam, I mean, in the emission trading scheme implementation. Should we differentiate between the local carbon, domestic carbon market and international market, or what? Thank you.
So the question is about cheating, right, Olia? Scams in the scheme, is that right? So the very key thing is that the government must have the ability to prevent cheating. If the government has a good tax collection system and has a measurement system for fossil fuel usage, then it's very possible for the government to implement the scheme, hopefully. But a reason why China took a long time to develop the scheme is that they needed to work out the best way for enforcement, monitoring and enforcement. If there is cheating, it doesn't work well. But please notice that other interventions also don't work well if there's cheating. For example, regulations, if there's cheating, the regulation doesn't work either. So a key prerequisite is that the government needs to be able to enforce the scheme. If some sectors are too hard, maybe they should be kept out of the carbon price scheme. And initially focus on the easy sectors for enforcement and then expand the scheme later. Thank you.
And Paul, there was just a question about the differences, or there was a point raised between the ETS and the carbon tax. So Ngoc Dang from Vietnam mentioned that there's a difference there in that the government revenue, the tax will result in government revenue, but the ETS is not necessarily resulting in revenue for government. Is that correct? Or can you explain a little bit about who the ETS, who do you pay, to get the permit?
An ETS can raise revenue if the permits are auctioned. And now the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme auctions these permits. It raises revenue. Also, a carbon tax, you could give emissions-free thresholds to firms, which eats into the revenue, actually. So in terms of revenue implications, they are actually the same, carbon tax and emissions trading scheme. Both of them can raise revenue. Ideally, they would. And ideally, that would happen with an ETS via auctioning the permits. Thank you.
Last question in this round, Pak Cristianto, apologies, did not see your hand raised there. You've got one quick question, if you could, for Paul.
I have quick questions regarding the ETS. So you say that the ETS, basically there's a permit auctioned by the government. Will it be possible for all these companies to trade between themselves? To, for example, company A have a permit for 10 carbon emissions, and then he sell the company sells to company B their permits, so the company B will have more allowance to pollute with this permit traded by the company A. So if that's possible, then will it be counterproductive for the goal to reduce the emissions? For example, the company with big finance can just buy all the permit from other companies, and then there will be, I don't know, huge pollution.
Thank you, Pak Cristianto. The first part is definitely correct. The idea with an emissions trading scheme is that you can trade permits. That's in the name of the scheme. So these permits, if your firm does not have enough, you can buy them from another firm. If you have too many, you can sell them. They're tradable items. The answer to the question at the end is no. The trading itself is not going to compromise the scheme. As long as emitters all are using permits, then the scheme will still do its job, because the total amount of emissions will be limited to the cap. And the cap is determined by the government by the number of permits, as shown in my video now. So that physical act of trading the permits around between different firms does not compromise the environmental integrity of the scheme. The key thing, though, is that the government makes sure that no one is emitting without a permit. I'll keep moving along, and let's cover a few more issues. Lots of issues on this topic. One question is carbon pricing effective? We did some research on this. We had a large international study, and we found that the answer is yes. And that's in line with economic theory as well, which would say yes. Countries with a carbon price, on average, we can see that their emissions are not growing as quickly and might even be falling. We find that on average, they have an emissions growth rate per annum, which is about 2 percentage points lower. So instead of growing by 1%, they're falling by 1%. As you'd expect, a higher carbon price helps to reduce emissions faster. Our results were very much in line with theory, and there are some other studies too, and the answer frequently is yes. As expected, carbon pricing is a very useful and very powerful instrument. What I'm going to do is keep moving along, but feel free to add in the chat. And at the end of the session, I'm going to add this question to Moodle to carry on the discussion. Which carbon pricing scheme would you recommend for your country? And remember, we have a carbon tax. It's the simplest. And many economists recommend a carbon tax. Tax and relax, go for the simple one. Cap and trade ETS. There are some advantages, especially on the quantity side. It will help you to meet the quantity goal of the country. Or a hybrid scheme. You could recommend a hybrid scheme for your country. Let's take that discussion to Moodle, and I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's views on it. Let's think about some of the schemes and have a look at them. First of all, the most famous scheme really is the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme. It was launched in 2005. These days, every year, the emissions cap, remember the cap is the number of permits. Every year, the emissions cap is cut by 2.2%. It's quite quick. If you keep cutting by 2.2% every year, you're reducing your emissions pretty nicely, aren't you? Before it was 1.74%, now it's 2.2% per annum. Current price, this price changes every day, actually within the day as well. A couple of weeks ago, the price was 70 euros approximately per ton CO2, very high, much higher than it was a few years ago. Currently, this scheme is in 30 countries, all of the EU countries, plus several other countries in Europe as well, including Iceland. I got data on CO2 emissions from just the energy sector for the EU. Well, one thing for sure is that emissions have been reducing. The EU ETS was introduced in 2005. Since then, emissions have reduced a lot. I'm not saying it's only due to the EU ETS. There are other stories, other contributing factors. But the truth is emissions have been reducing since the introduction of the EU ETS. And altogether, it has done its job. If you want it to do more, well, the way to do it is cut the cap by more each year. How about closer to home? Singapore's carbon tax commenced in 2019 at Singaporean $5 per ton CO2 equivalent. It's about $3 or $4 per ton CO2. Singapore's carbon tax covers about 80% of emissions. Specifically, it applies to the electricity, manufacturing, waste, and water sectors. It does not cover transport. Well, it does not cover agriculture and land sector, but Singapore does not have much agriculture. The tax rate will increase to $25 per ton CO2 in 2024 and has this nice schedule to at least $50 by 2030. That's what I was mentioning before. Start low, but go high in the future so that investors know where it is heading. How about other ASEAN countries? Well, currently, Singapore is the only ASEAN country with a formal carbon price, but there are some movements. Indonesia is moving towards a carbon tax, and there's, I know, a lot of attention to this issue and design of this issue. The goal of Indonesia is also to move towards broader carbon markets and extend to other sectors in future. Indonesia's initial first step of carbon tax is only for coal power stations. Other countries, including Vietnam, are currently considering this issue, and Vietnam, in the law of environmental protection, the updated version, it does include the mention of an emissions trading scheme establishment. So there's work there being done. How about Indonesia? It's a very interesting case. Indonesia is currently about to implement what is called cap and tax. Interesting wording of this scheme. The idea here actually is that this is a carbon tax scheme with an emissions tax threshold, or a carbon tax free threshold. That's what is meant really by cap and tax here. The idea in simple forms is there's a tax rate of about $2 per ton CO2, quite low. I think quite smart to start low as well. The revenue will be available for climate mitigation efforts. It will be focused on coal power stations in the first tranche, the first years. The idea is to expand it out. 2025 is actually not very far away, so by 2025 to be expanding out. Coverage. Ideally, a carbon price would have broad coverage to give the incentive to drive emissions down across the whole economy, ideally. However, in some activities, emissions might be difficult to measure. And in some activities, it might be very easy. If emissions are difficult to measure, and by that I mean emissions from an individual firm or factory, well, carbon tax can be difficult. So typically, a carbon tax is introduced only for some sectors of the economy and then expanded over time as the monitoring and enforcement system improves. Agriculture is often excluded at the start, but maybe could be included later if possible. I just want to emphasize this purple sentence here. It's very important. Emissions must be able to be measured to be priced. If the government cannot do it, well, work out how to do it first and then think about a carbon tax. Some countries are not ready yet, but actually many countries are ready. How to measure fossil fuel emissions? We need to have a measurement system. A regulator is needed to carry out monitoring, reporting and verification and enforcement of the scheme. If the firms are cheating, it needs to be a big penalty to give an incentive not to be cheating. For fossil fuels, how to calculate the emissions? The emissions are not calculated by measuring what floats into the sky. Can you see what I'm doing with my hand? No one is measuring what floats into the sky in any country. The way these schemes are measured, emissions are measured under these schemes, is by using formulae. For example, fossil fuel use times the emissions factor for that fossil fuel, and then add it up across all fossil fuels. So coal times the coal emissions factor, plus oil times the oil emissions factor, plus with more detail. If there are different types of coal, bring it into the formula. This is how emissions are measured. It's a proxy, but that's what we want. That's how it's done. And it's not done by measuring what's going into the sky. This is true everywhere. Use of revenue. It's a very important topic. Carbon tax revenue collected is not a cost to the economy. It's a transfer. Economists would all be agreeing on this point. It's a transfer. It is money that is transferred from one to the other. That money can then be used. What are the options? One option is to give it back to the people. For example, increase the cash transfers to the people or cut their tax rate. The best option for your country, I'll leave it to you to think about. Each country has different priorities. We could use the tax revenue to fund important government spending projects. If your country is struggling with infrastructure investment, well, maybe the best use is to build infrastructure, internet infrastructure, for example, broadband. If your priority is to build schools, there you go. You should go for the priority. So the use of the revenue is actually quite a different topic. Government revenue into the budget should go to the best possible use. Revenue does not have to be used to improve the environment, but it could be. And if that is useful, and also if it's useful for communicating the package, then it's a very good idea as well. If your concern is low-income households, one way to go about it is to increase cash transfers that are targeted at them. It could make them better off in net terms. For example, in Indonesia, use the social protection card and increase the payment and improve the coverage of it if needed. Correct, I'd like to pause. Any questions? There's some questions in the chat. Aline, you're asking some great questions. How to decide what sector should use carbon tax, carbon market, or other instrument? It's a good question. My personal advice would be go for carbon tax and as many sectors as possible. It's easy, avoids the trading issue, tax and relax. It could be possible to argue for this sector, we will have a carbon tax. But for that sector, we wanted to be involved in carbon trading markets and have an international connection for some reason, and to do separate things in different sectors. The argument for doing that is not obvious. If you have a good argument, maybe, but in general, we should just go for one instrument for the economy. And what Singapore has done is a good approach. Keep it easy, carbon tax, it increases over time. I just want to really emphasize how important ease of implementation is. Singapore's policy is so simple, we could write it on one piece of paper and that's it. It's very easy to understand, doesn't involve lots of trading and complications.
Okay. Apologies, I was on mute before. There's your explanation of the monitoring and reporting and verification was really important as well, because we had lots of questions early on about that. If anyone still has questions on that, put your hand up and we'll let you ask them as well. There was one question about in there about the carbon tax and how it might work with a fuel tax that's existing at the moment. So how do you kind of design a carbon tax when there are already other taxes in place, and how do you make them kind of work together?
It's a brilliant question. In some settings, if there's already a big fuel tax for one sector, well, you could argue, let's not put the carbon tax on that sector. Specifically, road transport in some countries, there's a big fuel excise already. And for example, in Australia, when we had the carbon price, it did not apply to road transport. We carved out that sector and left it as was. It's possible in some other settings that you introduce the carbon tax and you could rationalize some other taxes and get rid of them or reduce them. So it depends on the setting, but one needs to just think logically, what was the role of the fuel tax? Is it fair and efficient to be adding the carbon tax on top? And there can be different ways to go about it in different settings.
There was also, Paul, a question around when you have a cap or an emission trading scheme, how do you allocate the permits? How do the permits get allocated?
The way to allocate there are different ways, but traditionally it's called grandfathering. That's the name of it, grandfathering. You give it to firms based on their historical emissions. If they were 2 years ago, if they were big emitters, well, maybe we should give them more. You don't have to go for this approach, but it's a bit common. You just want to make sure that it's based on their historical emissions, not their current emissions. If they have an incentive to emit a lot now to get more permits, that's not good. So that's one way to go about it. Another way would be just to give it to sectors based or electricity generators based on their overall size. You can even give permits to the solar farm and then they can sell the permits on. So it's possible to do it in different ways. Oh, I might keep going and we'll just get through a couple more things and then come back for some more questions. Carbon credits. It's possible in some countries for projects to be generating what's called a carbon credit. These are voluntarily registered projects that can generate certificates. These certificates are not emissions reductions. These certificates are not for emissions. These certificates are for emissions reductions. The best example is for tree planting. So a carbon credit is a credit when you reduce emissions. If you are planting trees like this one, this is a project in Australia. They're planting trees. The trees are capturing emissions from the sky. They're able to create carbon credits from the project. Those carbon credits could then be purchased by firms to reduce their carbon tax or emissions trading scheme obligations. This is called offsetting if you do that. Okay, I'm emitting, but I'm also buying some carbon credits and that can help me to reduce the number of permits in the emissions trading scheme that I need. Planting trees is the best example, but there can be some other types of projects that produce carbon credits too. A regulator is needed for carbon credits to prevent cheating. If it's possible to cheat, then we would expect cheating to happen in the production of carbon credits. There need to be clear rules and it needs to be regulated. This is a very artificial market and a regulator is very important to make sure that what you're buying is actually something very credible. Some challenges with carbon credits. Some projects may be providing emissions reductions that might have happened anyway. Maybe those trees would have grown anyway. If so, that is called an additionality problem. It's a bit of a problem, underlying problem with carbon credits. If so, the credits would not represent genuine energy use or emissions reductions. This is called an additionality problem. There can be some other challenges with carbon credits, such as leakage. So that means I plant the trees here, but I cut some other trees over there. And actually nothing really changes to the environment. That's called leakage if we see emissions being pushed to other places and is a problem with carbon credits. Typically, we want to be careful with carbon credits, handle with care. Don't allow too many carbon credits coming in to your carbon pricing scheme. Make sure those carbon credits are high quality, that they're representing genuine emissions reductions and that they're not subject to low quality projects. I just want to mention another couple of things and then we're almost at the end. European Union is currently thinking about imposing a carbon price on other countries, specifically on imports to the EU of products such as steel that were produced elsewhere, such as Vietnam, and had emissions elsewhere. This would be a border tariff related to the emissions intensity of the product in its production. A way to avoid paying this is to introduce a carbon price in your country at a good level of carbon price. So this mechanism helps to give an incentive for other countries to introduce carbon prices. How high to set a carbon price? Well, it's a very good question. I mentioned start low and go high. But please think for yourself, what would be the best strategy? The World Bank recommends that countries aim eventually for a carbon price of more than $40 per ton CO2. It's quite high. Why? Because if we just stick with a very low carbon price for too long, we won't reduce emissions by enough. We need to get it up there. One motivation for a higher carbon price is climate change. Another is the local benefits. And the World Bank does point these out quite strongly. There are local benefits. It helps to reduce local air pollution. It helps to reduce local traffic congestion if it's applied to the road sector. And if it's applied to the road sector, it can also help to boost road safety as well. That's one of the interesting benefits of carbon pricing. Almost at the end, one thing is, what are the current carbon prices? There's a lot of variation across countries. Some countries have the very high one and some have the low one, for example, Singapore. There's a lot of variation, but in general, countries have started low and then have worked to the very high one over time. I want to just cover these other things before handing over. How to introduce carbon pricing. Keep it simple. Go for one that's rising over time. Start with the key emitting sectors for which measurement is possible for the government. I've been mentioning these points along the way. Be strict about carbon credits. Make sure they're high quality. Use the revenue in an attractive way as determined by your country. At the start, I already did mention other policies, but there can be other policies to introduce at the same time or instead of carbon pricing. If carbon pricing is impossible, well, there are some other alternatives. Renewable subsidies is one of them, and there are many other policies as discussed earlier. I want to just wrap up here with the conclusion. Negative externalities should ideally be priced. A carbon price is a very good way to do that. This sentence in the box is a similar one to what I said earlier on. If you look across all of the potential economic reforms for countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, carbon pricing is arguably one of the most important for a green economy and also for meeting the emissions reduction goals. All right, thank you very much, and handing over for any final activities. Thank you.